The Sun's defense editor has just dropped his summary of his year in the war in Ukraine. And it has some great takes, some facts that even I haven't heard. And we're going to talk about how the strategy on both sides has evolved over time. Let's get into it.
Of our profession.
All right, so I'm almost certainly, okay. I hope the YouTube censors understand that this is a war reporter's footage. This is like journalism. I'm doing some analysis here, so please don't demonetize me.
On the first day of the war, Russia launched a series of missile strikes right across Ukraine. That morning,
Okay, so when we talk about this sort of missile strikes, this is usually referred to as preparation of the battlefield. And preparation of the battlefield takes a couple of different forms, right? One is intelligence preparation of the battlefield. And this has probably happened in the weeks, really probably months and years leading up to this conflict. This is learning about all sorts of things, not just the military and geographic disposition of the country, right? Routes you can travel, where Ukrainian armed forces are stationed and what their defense strategy will be, but on other things. Where is the population potentially loyal to Russia? Russia probably looked at vulnerabilities in the leadership and in the governance structure, communications, right? So they did their intelligence prep, then they engaged these preparatory fires, and these likely targeted not just military sites, but the military's ability to respond to Russian actions. We also saw it in preparatory cyber attacks, right? Ukrainian infrastructure like banks and power stations and electrical grids were attacked by Russian cyber forces. So all of this sort of preparatory work is a pretty standard tactic, again, for Russia that at this time was really trying to borrow from the NATO playbook.
I woke up in Severodonetsk. I don't mind admitting I felt scared, I felt concerned, and that initial wave of panic did pass, but nonetheless, there was this lingering background level of anxiety because none of us really knew what was going to happen. In the first wave of the assault, we saw an attempt to take the capital, Kyiv. It failed for a number of reasons, but perhaps one of the most significant.
Yeah, some of these things... Russia may have been trying to, again, borrow a page from the U.S. playbook or coming to the same conclusion that the U.S. did, engaging in something that we referred to as shock and awe. And this was the idea that there was a portion of this preparatory phase of the invasion that was deliberately spectacular, literally a spectacle. And that was in order to show the general population, but more importantly, the leadership in these primary cities, that the power and might of the U.S. forces, literally intimidation, sort of like a bully taking off their shirt and showing you how much bigger they are than you. The idea is to create an intimidation factor that reduces the willingness to fight against such a powerful opponent. And I believe that that's some of the driver of some of those missile strikes that targeted civilian infrastructure that we just saw.
Was that the Russians had lost the element of surprise. The Russian troops who were given the mission to attack Hostomel airfield were given their orders about 3 days before the invasion. And we now understand they started boasting. They were so excited, they started discussing this mission on unencrypted lines. So what that meant is that when those forces arrived, they were met by significant force. There was a Ukrainian force lying in wait for that attack.
And this is really interesting for a bunch of reasons. So when we talk about what this sort of thing is, it's referred to as Opsec. And Opsec, or operational security, is a way to manage risk in a military or strategic environment. And it looks at what information is so sensitive that it cannot be leaked and must be protected. And Opsec is really hard because it requires every individual soldier who's aware of some of this information to keep it secure. And so even, the term was coined in the Vietnam War by PACOM, and they realized how robust the Vietnamese were able to, or how robust their intelligence collection efforts were. So things like what you disclose in a letter home, or what sort of things you talk about on the phone, all of these things can be Opsec violations. And you have to understand the difference between routine and critical information. You have to understand how the enemy is collecting that information. You have to look at your own systems for vulnerabilities, and then you have to take steps at the risk. But you may be realizing that and apply appropriate countermeasures, right? So you may think to yourself, wow, this would require almost every individual soldier to understand the vulnerabilities, the threats that the enemy poses, and to know what information they have to keep close hold and what they can't. And the truth is, this is something that requires smart soldiers. They need to be highly trained, they need to be disciplined, and they need to have analytic skills that they understand that they can't put in a letter, for example, hey, mom, I'm going to be moving next week. That's like a maybe, hey, mom, our unit is on the move again. Probably fine. Might be an issue, right? That's like a maybe, but things like, hey, we are going after Hostomel Airport. We can't wait to seize the airport, or we're going to participate in an air assault mission. It's going to be crazy. That sort of information is a huge Opsec violation. And when we talk about the lack of professionalization in the Russian forces, those sort of failings are what I'm talking about. These were Russian airborne troops. These were VDV. These were the best soldiers that the Russian armed forces had. And they couldn't adhere to simple Opsec or refuse to. And it's oftentimes could be seen as a commentary really on the leadership, the Russian leadership's weakness in this process.
Now, the reason the Russians needed Hostomel Airfield was because they wanted to create an airhead. They wanted to take an airfield at which they could then fly in a lot of their heavy armor, their heavy guns, their armored personnel carriers, even fly in tanks. Now, because that failed, that's why we saw those scenes of that 40.
Yes, this is a key aspect and this is why this is actually one of the core missions of the U.S. military's Ranger Regiment. They have done some of these airborne operations where they are able to secure small, highly valuable infrastructure, oftentimes that facilitates the moving of additional material in. And so one example would be obviously taking an airfield, because it has everything you need. It has a control tower. It has it has multiple runways. Oftentimes these have established cargo facilities, areas where planes can naturally taxi, unload cargo, stage cargo. They have fueling areas that are often already protected. It's hard to understate how much more valuable it is to take one of these airports intact. And that's why you can't use that's why you can't simply bomb the airport into oblivion, right? You can't use like big missile strikes to just tear the thing apart, because you need everything intact for it to be worth it. Otherwise, you're better off just building your own military airport. But that takes, weeks, even with the best militaries. So using these surgical forces like the VDV or the Army Rangers to take airports is a time-honored tactic.
That's why we saw those scenes of that 40-kilometer long convoy getting bogged down in the mud. And as that convoy got bogged down, it became easier and easier for the Ukrainians to harass it with guerrilla-style tactics, small unit tactics, going in and generally degrading Russian forces, degrading Russian morale. Now, they'd also failed simultaneously in their attempts to assassinate President Zelensky and attempts to take out Ukraine's top leadership. In those first days, we saw the assault from the southeast towards Mariupol. That was from Russian soil, from the direction of sort of Rostov-on-Don. Troops burst out of Crimea and they moved northwest towards Kherson. Now, this is quite interesting. They seized Kherson very quickly and without an awful lot of resistance. Not with no resistance, but without an awful lot of resistance. And there's some suggestions, there's a wide-held belief now in Ukraine that perhaps they were assisted on that assault by traitors, by insiders. Perhaps people failed to destroy bridges, which could have slowed their advance. There's a sense that the Russians knew their way through minefields, and the only way they could have done that is if they'd had access to secret maps about where those minefields were located. The result of which was a few days into the conflict, they had seized most of Kherson province, including Kherson city, which was on...
Okay, this is another really interesting fact. And when we talked about the preparation of the battlefield and intelligence preparation of the battlefield, you can see why these sort of small investments. You may ask yourself, well, why is it important for Russia to cultivate intelligence networks or to have agents within provincial governments, right? But look at who would have known this information or been able to provide it. It would have been the Kherson province, minister, deputy of transportation, right? Something that you probably don't even know who is in charge of transportation in your state, but getting access to some of this information, or maybe their version of like a National Guard commander. All this sort of infiltration is something that takes years. It's not the result of a couple weeks or a couple days, but you can see that just a couple of people working for years to build these infiltration networks, when it came time to harvest that fruit for Russia, it was tremendously successful, and for Russia, allowed them to preserve a lot of their combat power and take Kherson, again, with minimal losses.
On the west bank of the Dnipro River, now, that was the only territory in those first days of the war, in fact, the only territory up to this point that Russia has seized on the west bank of the Dnipro River. That then allowed them to attack a place called Mykolaiv, another major city in the south, a major naval port. This was the Battle of the Bug, it was the battle for Mykolaiv. Now, if that city had fallen, there would have been no natural obstacles between Russian forces and Odessa, the jewel port city of Odessa. So we saw the failure in the north in Kyiv. We saw the assault on Mariupol, which of course was bogged down, and that assault went much slower than they wanted. And then we saw, from a Russian point of view, a relatively successful assault through Kherson, but then they were held up at Mykolaiv. In terms of the first time I encountered the violence, on the 25th of February, we drove up to Kharkiv and we drove to the northern edge of the city.
This is one of the things that we talk about. You can see here that when we talk about the NATO style of warfare, right? The NATO style of warfare is to never reach a point where, like he talked about, the enemy forces had their command and control intact. They were able to get intelligence and understand what was happening on the ground. And then they were able to respond to that situation. As you can see, right, being able to hold the Russians at Mykolaiv, being able to hold the Russians at Mariupol, or delay them considerably, right? They were able to make decisions that were dynamic and responsive to Russia's strategies. This is, right, the sign of a failure of a maneuver warfare, or what we sometimes call airland battle. Airland battle is not actually the U.S. military now has a different term for their doctrine, but it's a conceptual framework that is really the dawn of this maneuvering. It basically talks about close coordination between land forces acting aggressively, maneuvering defense, and air forces attacking rear echelons, feeding those frontline enemy forces. It replaced active defense, and itself was replaced by something called full spectrum operations. But full spectrum operations are also like airland battle plus counterinsurgency performed seamlessly, which Russia actually could have used here as well. But airland battle, right? Rapid wars, they talk about forward defense. Forward defense, again, is this concept like we talked about where you basically go all in on offense is the best way to think of it. And you break up your enemy's ability to supply themselves, to command their forces, and then you move faster than their degraded command can respond to. And as soon as Ukrainian command was able to start responding to the situation faster than Russia could advance beyond it, when Ukraine established that common operating picture, the ability to rapidly end the war, that door was closed to Russia.
Kherson, but then they were held up at Mykolaiv. In terms of the first time I encountered the violence, on the 25th of February, we drove up to Kharkiv and we drove to the northern edge of the city. At the junction of the ring road, we found a Ukrainian unit. And while we were there, while we were chatting to them, suddenly they all started diving for cover. We could hear the distant explosions of artillery guns, and then we could hear the much closer explosions of those rounds hitting home, hitting Kharkiv, and that was terrifying. It really brought home that feeling I'd had the day before of being on the wrong end of a Russian invasion. I remember standing on the platform and the carriages inside were filling up with mums and their young children, and the people left on the platform were the dads and the brothers and the sons. And I remember watching a father with his finger drawing a heart on the mist on the outside the train window, and his wife tracing that heart with her finger on the inside. And it was just an incredibly poignant and really human, heartbreaking moment where you saw what was happening, just families being wrenched apart and not necessarily knowing when they were ever going to see each other.
Okay, so I'm going to actually skip ahead a little bit. Not to say, but a lot of these are about civilians. He also talks about encountering a Russian KIA, which is definitely going to get me demonetized. So we're just going to move past this. Instead, now he talks about when he interviewed a Russian prisoner of war.
Russian soldiers who've taken part in this conflict.
But I want to actually point out one detail that he does talk about that I found really interesting is that the pipeline, right, for Ukraine's mobilization, a lot of military-age males are not yet fighting. And the reason is because of training constraints. It's really hard to get those soldiers through even a rudimentary level of training. And unlike Russia, that gets soldiers on the battlefield by cutting their training exponentially, right? Ukraine wants to make sure that it puts soldiers on the battlefield who can operate the systems, who can integrate into the forces, who aren't going to become a burden to their commanders, who, again, in this Western style of warfare, the commanders have a much more personal investment in their units. And when we talk about Western support for Ukraine, we think in terms of material stuff. But the reality is that the training element is just as important. You might be fans of the channel of Sivdiv. I react to some of his videos on this channel, and I react to others on the Patreon. But you should definitely check him out. And he actually served in the Ukrainian Foreign Legion for, I think, like 6 months or 3 months or something, several months, and now is actually training Ukrainian soldiers, right? Soldiers in training. He's putting them through drills and exercises, teaching them small unit tactics, making them not fully professional soldiers, but much more proficient in soldiering. And being able to do that is an essential function for any military. And it's one of the reasons that Russia has struggled with personnel in this war is because they have gutted their training formations. They've pulled so many of their soldiers off of training that the standard and the number of days of training these soldiers get before they show up in combat has plummeted. So the fact that Western aid is continuing to flow in, it also has to be accompanied by appropriate training. Again, you can't just give someone a Leopard tank. Do you know how to drive a Leopard tank? I don't. I would need training. You would need training. The Ukrainians also need training.
Still alive, and those were prisoners of war in a prisoner of war camp in central Ukraine. It's very difficult to interview prisoners of war, and we were very mindful to try and do this in a way that did not breach the Geneva Conventions, and so we were very careful to keep them anonymous. And we could only interview them in the presence of their captors, their Ukrainian captors. But nonetheless, the stories that they told us were of an army that was ill-equipped and demoralized and poorly led. And indeed, I remember one of the soldiers described his commanding officers as jackals. After about 100...
This is actually really interesting because if you read any accounts of Russian soldiers in the Soviet-Afghan War or the Chechen Wars, there is a huge disparity between Russian commanding officers and the soldiers in their command. Oftentimes, commanders are barely involved in soldiers' day-to-day lives, simply demanding that they report for inspection prior to an operation and receive a brief on what they're going to be doing. And it is a now there is a significant cultural gulf between NATO officers and enlisted troops. Like, don't get it twisted. But as much as officers and enlisted sometimes dunk on each other, the truth is that the level of closeness between an officer and his enlisted soldiers or their enlisted soldiers is orders of magnitude deeper than what exists in Russian military culture. Things like, I was personally involved as a junior officer in my soldiers' divorces. No, I knew when every soldier had a child due because we would schedule their leave around it. Health issues, even the most minor health concerns, I really cared about, right? Because I'm a human being and I care about my soldiers. But even if I was a heartless jerk, I still would care because I needed to know their capabilities, their availability, how much care they would need if there were certain missions I couldn't assign them. And that's the norm for a NATO style officer, right? Is knowing your soldiers really well, executing the mission, but then protecting them and giving those soldiers all the tools they need to succeed, including things like training, rest, morale boosting, all of it. Russian military culture just doesn't seem to have that.
Conflict. I went to a place called Lysychansk. We met a couple of families who'd come out of their block of flats partly destroyed. They were cooking on a wood fire, and just about 30, 40 yards away from where they were cooking their supper, they'd buried one of their neighbors who'd been killed in a strike a few days earlier, and yet still they didn't want to leave. They could have done. There were humanitarian organizations, volunteers were driving in along similar routes that we'd used to offer these people an opportunity to flee, but there was a sense that perhaps these people who were staying were possibly the people who do support Russia, who were perhaps waiting for the Russian invasion to take the city, and that was quite a salutary lesson.
That is also really interesting. I hadn't heard that. I assumed it was just because some people are just stubborn jerks. As a stubborn jerk myself at times, I appreciate it. But yeah, at that point, if you're pro-Russian and the Russians leave, you should probably leave with them. Anyway, guys, we're going to have to pause it there. I'm actually running short on time. If you want access to some of those combat videos that I talked about, and I do those breakdowns on the Patreon. They're a great way to support the channel, especially given that YouTube demonetizes just about everything nowadays. And thanks to our Colonel and Lieutenant tier patrons, this has to be updated. But I will catch you guys in the next one. Oh, and let me know if you want me to do part 2. Catch you guys later.